Today we delve into one of the most turbulent and dramatic chapters of ancient warfare, the Iberian War, fought between two mighty empires, the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire. This was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of civilizations. From the rugged highlands of the Caucasus to the fortified cities of Mesopotamia, the war raged for over a decade, reshaping borders, alliances, and imperial ambitions. Join me as we unravel the full saga of the Iberian War, its causes, key moments, and lasting impact on the course of history. Following the conclusion of the Anastasian War, the Byzantine Empire and Sasanian Persia agreed to a 7-year truce. Remarkably, this agreement endured for nearly 2 decades. In AD 526 or 527, the aging Kavadh requested that Emperor Justin adopt his son Khusro in a manner akin to the previous century's adoption of Arcadius and Yazdegerd. However, Justin, after consulting legal experts, offered only a limited form of adoption. This version, consistent with Roman traditions regarding non-citizens, did not grant Khusro the full privileges associated with Roman adoption, such as the potential to inherit the empire. Kavadh perceived this as a deliberate affront, particularly since Yazdegerd's earlier relationship with the Byzantines had been marked by loyalty. Religious dynamics further exacerbated tensions in the region during this period. Lazica, a kingdom traditionally aligned with the Sasanian Empire, converted to Christianity and shifted its allegiance to the Byzantine Empire. This change was symbolized by the Lazic king's ceremonial adoption of Emperor Justin as his godfather. Lazica's defection encouraged other Christian kingdoms in the Caucasus, such as Iberia, to reconsider their own political alignments. Iberia, firmly under Persian control since the late 4th century, grew increasingly dissatisfied with King Kavadh's attempts to impose Zoroastrian practices. Procopius, the sole source for these events, describes how Iberian ruler Gorgians sought and received assurances from Justin that the Byzantine Empire would protect Iberia. Emboldened by these promises, Gorgians renounced Persian authority and aligned his kingdom with the Byzantines. As part of his strategic efforts to consolidate power in the east, Emperor Justinian, who succeeded Justin, took measures to fortify the empire's eastern frontiers. He incorporated key Armenian provinces into the Byzantine domain and stationed Roman garrisons in strategic locations to consolidate control and defend against potential Persian retaliation. Violence escalated at various points where the influences of the two empires collided. In AD 525, a Roman fleet transported an Aksumite army to conquer Himyarite Yemen. During the same period, from AD 525 to 526, Persia's Arab allies, the Lakhmids, conducted raids on Roman territories bordering the desert. The Romans sought to extend their influence in Yemen, both to protect Christian interests and to dominate the spice and silk trade routes to India, which were under Persian control. By 526 to 527, direct conflict had erupted between the two empires in the Transcaucasus region and Upper Mesopotamia. In response, Justin dispatched Peter, his former secretary, to Lazica, along with some Huns, while Kavadh countered by assigning a substantial army to a certain Bose. The Persian campaign was highly effective. They swiftly overran Iberia, compelling King Gorgians and the Iberian nobility to seek refuge in Lazica. Ultimately, Gorgians and his court relocated to Constantinople. The initial Persian assaults were remarkably successful. To alleviate the pressure on Iberia, a diversionary operation was launched. The first Byzantine offensive took place in Perse Armenia in 526. Following established protocols, Sidus and Belisarius led a force into Perse Armenia, where they conducted widespread plundering and returned with spoils and captives. This incident is notable as it marks the first appearance of Belisarius as an individual military leader, who would later become one of Byzantium's most celebrated generals. Given the success of the expedition, a subsequent invasion was initiated. However, by this point, the Persians had made adequate preparations for defense. In an unnamed battle, Cidas and Belisarius were defeated by the Persians under the command of Narses and Aratius. Unfortunately, no details of this encounter have survived. Following Peter's inability to defend Iberia effectively, he was recalled to Constantinople, either by Emperor Justin or by both Justin and Justinian. In response to the crisis, 3 magistri militum, Irenaeus, Syricus, and Gilderic, were sent to retake Iberia. However, the division of command among the 3 generals led to operational disarray, culminating in a significant defeat for the Byzantine forces in 528. As a result of this failure, Justinian reinstated Peter as commander of the campaign in the Caucasus. Peter adopted a more centralized approach, consolidating all available Byzantine forces in one location and withdrawing troops from Iberia. This strategy culminated in a decisive victory over the Persian forces. Following this success, Peter fortified his position by garrisoning 2 key frontier forts, Sarapanis and Scanda, with Roman troops. The Roman strategy emphasized controlling critical strongholds to secure the frontier. However, logistical difficulties in supplying the garrisons soon undermined this approach. By approximately 529, the Byzantines were compelled to abandon the forts, which were subsequently occupied by the Persians. The successful defense of Lazica, however, necessitated the formation of alliances, and Justinian excelled in this aspect. In 527, he successfully brokered an alliance with Boa, the queen of the 100,000 Sabiri Huns. This alliance proved highly beneficial in 527 or 28, when Boa annihilated 20,000 other Huns, who were en route to support the Persians. As a result, Peter was spared from having to confront these Huns in Lazica. Following this, there were no significant developments in the region during the war. The Romans, with the backing of Lazica, maintained control over the remainder of the territory, while the Persians had reclaimed Iberia. This effectively marked the division of influence in the Transcaucasus and the entrenchment of the 2 empires in open conflict. The Persian offensive against Lazica alarmed both Justin and Justinian, as it introduced the possibility that the Persians could seize control of the Lazican coastline and conduct naval operations in the Black Sea against Constantinople. In 527, the Byzantines launched a series of diversionary and preemptive incursions into Persian territory, utilizing forces stationed near the border. This strategy included the construction of 2 fortresses along the frontier to strengthen defensive positions. To support this effort, the Magister Militum per Orientem, Libellarius, led a diversionary campaign intended to draw Persian attention away from these activities. Libellarius first advanced on Nisibis but failed to capture the city. He then moved against Thibitha, but this effort also proved unsuccessful. Both sieges were conducted with minimal determination, as Libellarius's primary objective was not territorial conquest but rather the distraction of Persian forces. After these inconclusive operations, he withdrew his army to Dara. However, the retreat proved disastrous, as many Byzantine infantry succumbed to the intense summer heat, highlighting significant logistical mismanagement. Belisarius's performance was widely regarded as inept, as such losses should have been avoidable with better planning and leadership. Recognizing this failure, Justinian dismissed Belisarius and replaced him with Hypatius, a seasoned commander tasked with curbing ongoing Arab raids and restoring effective control over the eastern frontier. Around this time, the Dux Mesopotamiae, Timostratus, died, and Belisarius was promoted to replace him, likely by order of Emperor Justinian. As a result, Belisarius assumed command at the strategic headquarters in Dara. A key component of Roman strategy against the Persians involved establishing and maintaining fortified posts along the frontier, with Dara being one of the most important. The region south of Dara, however, had long been vulnerable to raids by both Arabs and Persians, and it was recognized that the defenses in this area needed strengthening. To address this vulnerability, the Byzantines attempted to fortify a desert site at Thannuris, south of Nisibis. The Persians, perceiving this as a direct threat, warned the Byzantines to halt construction or face invasion. In response, Justinian reinforced Belisarius's forces with a substantial contingent of commanders and troops. This included the Duces of Phoenicia, Kutzes and his brother Butzes, along with Sebastian, some Isaurians, the Dux of Phoenicia, Procleanus, Vincent, the Comos Basil, and the Ghassanid Arabs under their king Thannuris. The scale of this force was considerable. Even if each commander brought only half their available troops, the force would have included approximately 7,000 infantry and 15,000 cavalry, supplemented by the Arabs and Bucailari. However, given the demands of fort construction in close proximity to enemy territory, a larger infantry presence, likely around 10,000, including Isaurians, was required to protect the workers. The cavalry force was probably the largest component of the army, with at least 25,000 Limitanite horsemen alongside Bucailari and Arab allies. This brings the estimated total force to approximately 30,000 cavalry, in addition to the infantry. Such a formidable force indicates the Byzantines anticipated a major confrontation and likely outnumbered the Persians. However, a critical flaw undermined their command structure. Belisarius, as a dux, held a rank that limited his authority over the other commanders, such as the Duces and Comos Basil. This lack of centralized authority would later have serious consequences for the coherence and effectiveness of the Roman forces in the field. As the Persian army advanced against the Romans to halt the construction of the fort, they were met with the unsettling realization that the Romans outnumbered them. The Persians had only managed to assemble 30,000 troops under the command of Peroz Mihran and Xerxes, son of Kavadh. Malalas explains that this limited number was due to the Persians simultaneously deploying a large force in Lazica. However, they did possess a crucial advantage over the Romans. Mihran was undoubtedly the overall commander. Based on the account of Zechariah Redder, we know that the battle occurred near Thannuris. In this engagement, the Persian general Mihran employed a double stratagem to outmaneuver the Byzantine forces. First, he led his army near Mindus, deliberately provoking the Romans into action. Once the Byzantines were drawn in, Mihran feigned a retreat, drawing them further south to Thannuris, where he had set a trap. Confident in their numerical superiority, the Romans pursued the Persians. However, once they reached the vicinity of Thannuris, Mihran executed a tactic reminiscent of one used by the Hephthalites against the Persian Shahanshah Peroz in 485. The Persians had dug concealed ditches among their trenches, leaving several strategically placed openings through which their troops could retreat. When Belisarius and the Roman army arrived, the Persians strategically positioned their cavalry in front of the concealed ditches. They then pretended to flee, deliberately luring the Roman forces into pursuit. Two impulsive young brothers, Kutzes and Butzes, took the bait and charged after the retreating Persians. Their reckless pursuit encouraged the rest of the Roman cavalry to follow suit. The Roman cavalry, eager to capitalize on their numerical advantage, galloped at full speed without caution. However, this haste proved disastrous, as the cavalry charge led them straight into the hidden ditches. The horses and riders fell into the pits, causing significant confusion and chaos in the Roman ranks. This trap severely disrupted the Roman cavalry's cohesion, giving the Persians a strategic advantage. During the battle, the Persians inflicted significant casualties on the Roman forces. The rash actions of the cavalry commanders led to the death or capture of several high-ranking officers. Kutuz was wounded and captured, while Proclianus was killed outright. Sebastian and Basil were also captured, and Tapharas, the Ghassanid ruler who fought as a Byzantine vassal, was thrown from his horse and killed by the Persians. The remaining Roman cavalry, likely composed of troops from the second line, retreated to Dara, accompanied by Belisarius. However, the Roman infantry was left behind, either slaughtered or taken captive. The infantry's morale was insufficient to conduct an organized retreat in a defensive formation, such as the hollow square or oblong formation, which would have been essential to defend against the Persian cavalry. At this point in the battle, it is clear that the Persian cavalry had a numerical advantage over the Roman infantry. Moreover, the Isaurian infantry, ill-equipped for combat against cavalry, contributed to the Roman defeat. While better equipped infantry might have been able to put up more resistance, the lack of morale and proper equipment led to the collapse of the infantry's effectiveness. The loss of the majority of the Roman forces in the east was a devastating blow, the consequences of which were still felt in subsequent battles, such as those at Dara and Satala 2 years later. In light of this disastrous defeat, Belisarius was promoted to Magister Militum per Orientum in AD 529, indicating that he was not held personally responsible for the failure. As dux, Belisarius lacked sufficient authority over the other commanders, which weakened his ability to control the situation. It is likely that he did not approve of the rash cavalry charge and the pursuit of the Persians from Myndus to Thannuris, but he may have been pressured into following these orders by his subordinates. His promotion to a higher rank was necessary to grant him the authority to command more effectively in future operations. The defeat at Thannuris not only necessitated the abandonment of the fortification project, but also exposed the Eastern Front to the potential of enemy invasion. In response, the emperor was compelled to implement emergency measures. Justinian dispatched several high-ranking officials, along with their bucellarii and regular units from the Balkans, to secure the cities. These forces were placed under the command of Pompeius, the brother of Hypatius and nephew of Anastasius. Fortunately for the Romans, an exceptionally harsh winter arrived, halting further military operations until the end of the year. In AD 528, the Byzantine Empire faced mounting challenges on multiple fronts. Following their defeats at Thannuris and Myndus, the Byzantines were still recovering when a crisis erupted in the Crimea. In either 527 or 528, the king of the Crimean Huns converted to Christianity and aligned himself with the Byzantine Empire. However, this decision proved controversial among his pagan subjects. Opposition to the king's conversion culminated in his assassination, along with the slaughter of the Roman garrison stationed at Bosporus. This event likely occurred during the summer of 528. Emperor Justinian recognized the urgency of the situation and swiftly organized a military response. A substantial force of Gothic foederati, commanded by John, the Comos of the Pontic Straits, was dispatched. They were joined by the Magister Militum per Thracias, Gadilas, and the Magister Militum of Scythia, Badorios, in late 528. Confronted by the steady Byzantine advance, the Huns retreated, leaving the region vulnerable. The Byzantines capitalized on this opportunity, securing the Crimea permanently for the empire. This victory had significant strategic implications. By securing the Crimea, the Byzantines enhanced their ability to monitor the steppes and influence the alliances formed by nomadic tribes, particularly those with the Sasanian Persians. This development strengthened Byzantine control over the region and improved their position in the broader geopolitical struggles of the era. The transfer of troops to the east and the temporary garrisoning of Crimea in 528 inadvertently created a power vacuum in Lower Moesia and Scythia. This left the regions vulnerable to invasion, and the Bulgarians seized the opportunity to strike. They inflicted a significant defeat on the Roman commanders Badorios and Justin, subsequently advancing deep into Thrace. This incursion strained Byzantine resources, as the empire could no longer spare troops for the eastern frontier. In response to this crisis, Emperor Justinian was compelled to negotiate with the warlord Mundus, who commanded a force of mercenaries. By 529 or 530, Mundus was appointed Magister Militum per Illyricum. Around the same time, Justinian also elevated Chalbudius to the position of Magister Militum per Thracias. Mundus swiftly took action, achieving decisive victories against both the Goths and the Huns. These Hunnic forces included a coalition of various barbarian tribes. Mundus not only recovered significant amounts of booty, but also captured one of their kings. According to the historian Marcellinus, 500 Bulgars were killed in these campaigns, although it is likely that this figure does not account for casualties among the other tribes involved. Together, Mundus and Chalbudius successfully restored stability to the Balkans by 530. Their efforts ensured the security of the region, allowing the Byzantine Empire to regain its footing amidst the broader challenges it faced. The situation on the eastern frontier also deteriorated in early 529. Arab chieftain Alamundaros launched a swift and audacious raid, advancing from the south through Emesa and Apamea, reaching as far as the gates of Antioch. Before the Byzantine forces could mobilize an effective response, Alamundaros and his raiders withdrew, leaving the region destabilized. In response, Emperor Justinian implemented a threefold strategy. First, he dispatched reinforcements to the east to retaliate against the raid. However, the results of this campaign remain unclear. Our primary source, the historian Malalas, mentions only that Justinian sent a significant contingent of infantry, referred to as the Leucocranitai from Phrygia, against Saracen and Persian territories. Secondly, Justinian addressed the failures in military leadership. He dismissed Hypatius, the Magister Militum per Orientem, for his inability to prevent Alamundaros's incursion. In his place, Justinian appointed the capable General Belisarius, whose leadership marked a significant shift in the management of the eastern frontier. Lastly, the raid exposed the southern section of the frontier as inadequately defended. To address this vulnerability, Justinian appointed Ghassanid Sheikh Arethas as Phylarch of the Arab tribes. This move unified the Byzantine-aligned Arab tribes under a single leader, creating a counterbalance to the Persian-aligned Saracens and enhancing the empire's defensive and offensive capabilities in the region. Given the challenging circumstances, it is unsurprising that Emperor Justinian sought to negotiate peace with the Sasanian Empire. To this end, he dispatched Hermogenes, the trusted Magister Officiorum, as an ambassador to the Persian court. However, the negotiations ultimately failed due to a combination of internal and external factors. At the same time, the Samaritan population, who faced religious persecution, launched a widespread revolt, further complicating Byzantine efforts to stabilize their realm. Meanwhile, Sasanian King Kavadh had, by 528 or 529, decisively crushed the last remnants of Mazdakite resistance within his empire. This victory solidified Kavadh's authority, placing him in a strong negotiating position. Exploiting this advantage, Kavadh issued two significant demands. The Byzantines were to either demolish the strategically critical walls of Dara or provide gold to fund the garrison stationed at the Caspian Gates. In response, Justinian employed a calculated strategy of delay. In July 529, he agreed to a one-year truce, aiming to buy time to strengthen his position. During this interval, he moved decisively to suppress the Samaritan revolt, restoring order in the affected regions. By June 530, Justinian believed the remaining month of the truce would provide an opportunity to negotiate further. However, King Kavadh had different plans, signaling the fragility of the temporary peace. King Kavadh planned to strike before the truce with the Byzantine Empire ended in July 530. By June, he had assembled two large armies to invade Roman territory. One army, stationed in Persia, aimed to sever Roman support for Lazica, while the other, based at Nisibis, was poised to attack the strategically significant fortress city of Dara. This impending threat was not unexpected, as the Byzantines, despite the truce, had been preparing for renewed hostilities. According to Procopius, Emperor Justinian appointed Belisarius as Magister Militum per Orientem, entrusting him with leading a campaign against the Persians. Belisarius gathered a force of approximately 25,000 men, which Procopius describes as substantial. This force marched to Dara, likely intending to either attack or pose a threat to Nisibis. Malalas reports that the army encamped outside Dara, awaiting further developments. To ensure unity of command, Justinian also dispatched Hermogenes, the Magister Officiorum, to assist Belisarius. Hermogenes' presence was critical, as it compelled other commanders who had previously refused to follow Belisarius to obey him. Additionally, Justinian sent Rufinus as an ambassador, although he was instructed to remain at Hierapolis until further notice. While the army under Belisarius was considered large, it likely included many inexperienced soldiers, a consequence of the heavy Roman losses, particularly among infantry, suffered in earlier battles, such as the defeat at Thannuris. The Roman force is estimated to have included approximately 7,500 cavalry and 17,500 infantry. Previous campaigns had demonstrated a tendency for Roman commanders to act impulsively, launching attacks without orders. Hermogenes' role in this campaign was, therefore, essential to maintain discipline and coordination. Opposing the Romans was a Persian army of 40,000 men led by General Peroz Mihran, who was stationed at Nisibis. His mission was to capture Dara, and he advanced his forces to Ammodius, a location 7.7 kilometers south of Dara. Ammodius was strategically chosen due to its abundant water supply, which was vital for the Persian horses. The Romans reached Dara just in time, learning upon their arrival that the Persian invasion of Roman territory was imminent. Procopius of Caesarea, serving as Belisarius' military secretary, provides a detailed, though occasionally ambiguous, eyewitness account of the Battle of Dara. From his description, the engagement lasted 2 days and unfolded with methodical precision on the Roman side. The Persian army broke camp and began its advance just before sunrise on the first day. In response, the Roman forces under the command of Belisarius and Hermogenes assumed a carefully prearranged defensive formation. Belisarius had fortified his position by constructing a series of defensive trenches across the main road between Dara and Nisibis. This system included a recessed central section flanked by 2 longer trenches on either side, connected by transverse trenches, and featured multiple narrow crossing points to allow Roman troops to maneuver. The Roman infantry formed the core of the defense, positioned in a single deep line behind the central trench. Belisarius and Hermogenes commanded this section, likely leading their personal bucellarii, who may have numbered several thousand. Interestingly, Procopius does not mention the deployment of light infantry skirmishers along the front, suggesting the defense relied heavily on the prepared trenches and disciplined heavy infantry. The Roman left wing consisted of several distinct units. On the far left, a detachment of Herule cavalry, commanded by Pharas, held the flank. To their right was a stronger cavalry contingent under the commander Buz. In the angle formed by the trench and the left center, 2 units of 300 Hunnic cavalry, led by Sunicas and Agon, were positioned for swift offensive or defensive action. The right wing mirrored the left in composition. A smaller force of around 600 Hunnic cavalry, commanded by Simus and Ascan, held the far right. Adjacent to them, and likely stationed behind the trenches, was a larger cavalry force under John, son of Nicetas, supported by subordinate officers Cyril, Dorotheus, Marcellus, and Germanus. The precise positioning of the Roman wings relative to the trenches is unclear in Procopius' account. However, based on subsequent descriptions of the battle, it is evident that the central division was stationed behind the trench, with the wings likely arranged similarly. The trench system was strategically designed to counter the numerical superiority of the Persian cavalry. By positioning their forces behind the trenches, the Romans could utilize the narrow crossing points to launch attacks or pursue retreating enemies without compromising their defensive posture. Placing the Roman troops in front of the trenches would have introduced significant risks. In the event of a powerful Persian assault necessitating a rapid retreat, the trenches, intended to impede the enemy, could have become a dangerous obstacle for the Roman forces themselves. Belisarius' deployment exemplified a calculated strategy to neutralize the Persian numerical advantage, using terrain and prepared defenses to enhance the cohesion and effectiveness of his forces. This careful arrangement ensured that Roman troops could act flexibly while minimizing the risk of being overwhelmed. Procopius states that the Roman trench was constructed approximately a stone's throw from the Pulae, facing the city of Nisibis. This term, Pulae, has led to two differing interpretations among historians. The majority, following Dewing's translation, interpret Pulae as gate, suggesting that the battle took place immediately in front of the city of Dara. However, Christopher Lillington Martin has proposed an alternative interpretation, arguing that Pulae refers to a geographical gap located just east of Ambar, approximately 2 to 3 kilometers south of Dara. This interpretation is supported by Malalas, who mentions that the Roman forces had encamped outside Dara, implying a location slightly removed from the city itself. The evidence is inconclusive, as both interpretations have merit. The Persian commander Perros approached Dara with such confidence that he reportedly sent a message to Belisarius, instructing him to prepare the baths, claiming he intended to use them the following day. However, upon arriving within sight of the Roman forces and observing their well-prepared formation, his confidence appears to have wavered. In response, Perros arranged his forces in a formation similar to that of the Romans, with infantry positioned in the center and cavalry on the flanks. He took direct command of the Persian center, while the left wing was led by General Belisarius and the right wing by Pityaxes. Although the exact size of the Persian forces remains uncertain, the elite Immortals were held in reserve to reinforce the line or exploit breakthroughs. The Persian army was deployed in two ranks, a tactic designed for sustained combat. As the front rank suffered casualties or depleted their arrows, the rear units could rotate forward to maintain pressure on the enemy. This arrangement highlighted the Persians' emphasis on endurance and adaptability in battle, complementing their numerical superiority. On the morning of the second day, both the Byzantine and Persian forces arrayed themselves in their respective battle formations, with the Byzantines taking the positions described earlier and the Persians forming deep ranks. Once in position, both armies halted, each awaiting the other's move. The Persians adopted a calculated strategy, believing that delaying their assault until the afternoon would work to their advantage. They reasoned that the Byzantine troops, accustomed to eating before midday, would become hungry and fatigued as the day progressed, thereby weakening their resolve. In contrast, the Persians, who traditionally ate later in the day, expected to maintain their strength and gain the upper hand. It was only in the afternoon that the Persian forces initiated their assault. General Perros began the battle by probing the Roman left flank with a cavalry detachment. After a brief clash, the Byzantine troops under Buz retreated, allowing the Persians to advance. However, the Persian advance soon stalled, as their commanders feared a potential counterattack from the Hunnic cavalry positioned in the Roman center. Sensing the hesitation, Buz ordered his forces to counterattack. The Persian cavalry, caught off guard, retreated hastily, reportedly losing 7 men in the withdrawal, according to Procopius. This exchange demonstrated the effectiveness of the Byzantine defensive strategy and their ability to exploit even momentary lapses in Persian confidence. After the initial clash, both armies returned to their formations, with the Persians' attempt to provoke the Romans into breaking their ranks having failed. At this point, a young Persian warrior issued a challenge to the Romans for a duel. The challenge was accepted by Buzez's bath attendant, Andreas, a skilled wrestler and trainer from Constantinople. Acting without orders, Andreas charged forward on horseback, striking the Persian in the right breast with his spear, knocking him to the ground. He then dismounted and, using a short sword, quickly ended the confrontation with a swift and decisive action. In response, the Persians sent out a more experienced duelist, showing signs of age with gray hair. At this point, Hermogenes ordered that no Roman should accept further challenges. However, Andreas defied orders again and faced the Persian in another duel. The two warriors charged at each other, their spear thrusts being deflected by armor, and their horses collided head-on, sending both men flying to the ground. Despite the shock of the fall, Andreas recovered more quickly, owing to his agility and training, while the Persian's larger size slowed him down. Andreas struck first, knocking the Persian down again and then killed him. The Roman forces, both those on the walls and in battle formation, erupted in a victorious cheer. The Persians, demoralized by the defeats in the duels, retreated to Immortals. Meanwhile, the Romans raised their battle hymn and withdrew behind their fortifications. Understandably, Perros Mihran, having seen the failure of the duels and recognizing the strength of the Roman position, hesitated to commit his forces to an attack on the well-defended Roman line, especially given the added protection of the field fortifications. The following day was marked by a cessation of hostilities, allowing both sides a brief period of respite. During this lull, the Persian forces were reinforced with an additional 10,000 troops dispatched from Nisibis, bolstering their strategic position. In the absence of immediate combat, diplomatic exchanges took place between the two factions. The Romans extended a formal request for negotiations, seeking to establish a dialogue aimed at reaching a settlement. In contrast, the Persians, through their response, accused the Romans of treachery and deceit, asserting that their adversaries had proven themselves untrustworthy in past dealings. This exchange of messages reflects the deep-seated mistrust and the complex diplomatic dynamics that characterize the interaction between the two empires during this period of conflict. On the third day, both commanders delivered motivational speeches to their troops, preparing for the upcoming confrontation.
There is an army of fools, brought to the field of death by lies and falsehoods. Our swords, spears, and arrows will kill them, but the true cause of their defeat and deaths is idiocy. Make ready! They take to the field, but those fools would do better preparing their own funeral pyres. We have the advantage. We have pressed forwards, and I would have not done so if victory would not be ours. Make ready, men!
The armies formed up once again outside the walls of Dara, just as they had during their initial meeting. During the deployment, Pharis, the Herul commander, proposed to Belisarius that he detach his 300 cavalry and position them behind a hill on the far left flank. This positioning would allow for a surprise attack on the Persian cavalry's flank, potentially inflicting significant damage. Belisarius, recognizing the tactical advantage, quickly agreed to the suggestion. However, once the armies were fully deployed and faced each other, no immediate action was taken. As historian Adrian Goldsworthy notes, the Roman formation was primarily designed to withstand a frontal assault, and with the walls of Dara so close behind them, the Persians would have no choice but to attack head-on if they intended to capture the city. Thus, Belisarius had no intention of initiating any offensive maneuvers, choosing instead to wait for the Persian attack. Meanwhile, the Persian commander Perros sought to delay the battle until noon, hoping to exhaust the Roman forces by preventing them from having their midday meal. However, this tactic did not appear to have the intended effect, as the Roman soldiers remained in their positions, undeterred by the delay. The battle began with an exchange of arrows, but this mainly occurred on the flanks. as Procopius does not mention any significant fighting in the center of the battlefield. The Persians, benefiting from a numerical advantage and the ability to rotate fresh archers to the front, were able to fire volleys that, as Procopius describes, darkened the sky, evoking comparisons to the Battle of Thermopylae. However, the Romans had a strong wind at their backs, which helped reduce the impact of the Persian archery. As the Persian archers ran low on arrows, Procopius notes that they resorted to using their spears in close combat. It is likely that the Persian cavalry had followed their standard tactic, where the first line consisted of lightly armed mounted archers, and the second line was made up of heavily armored cavalry. When the Persians decided to charge, they typically merged these two lines, with the heavily armored cavalry forming the front ranks in a unified charge. This tactic was designed to exploit both the range of the archers and the shock value of the heavily armored cavalry when they engaged in close combat. The battle on the Roman left flank became increasingly intense. The Roman soldiers there were not facing the usual Persian troops, but rather the Cadasai, a fierce tribe from Beth Arabia. After a brutal struggle, the Roman left was pushed back and began to falter. At this critical moment, the heralds, commanded by Pharas, appeared over a hill and launched a charge into the Persian flank and rear. This sudden attack caused confusion among the Persian forces, with their lines wavering. At the same time, two other Roman commanders, Sunicus and Igan, with 600 Huns, launched an assault on the opposite flank. The combined pressure led to the collapse of the Persian cavalry, which retreated in disarray toward the safety of their infantry, leaving approximately 3,000 dead behind them. The Romans, however, did not pursue the fleeing Persians, instead returning to their previous positions. Following a brief pause, during which both sides regrouped, Peroz, the Persian commander, made a strategic move by transferring the Immortals to the left wing with the aim of overwhelming the vulnerable Roman right flank. This flank was exposed as it lacked any natural terrain features for protection. Belisarius and Hermogenes quickly recognized the threat and responded by ordering Sunicus and Igan to position themselves at a right angle to the main Roman line, with Simois and Ascon reinforcing them. Behind them, Belisarius positioned additional reserves to provide further support. The final phase of the battle began with a general assault, focusing heavily on the Roman right wing. The pressure was intense, forcing the cavalry under John to retreat in disarray. However, the Persian forces, focused on the retreating Roman cavalry, were caught off guard by a counterattack from the Huns, who struck the Persian flank. This Byzantine countercharge proved highly effective, cutting through the Persian line and splitting it into two sections. The larger portion of the Persian force continued its pursuit of the retreating Roman cavalry, but the smaller section, now isolated from both the main Persian line and the advancing units, found itself in a perilous position. The battle then devolved into a chaotic melee. Amidst the confusion, the Persian standard, carried by Commander Beresmans, fell. Realizing their vulnerable position, the advancing Persian units attempted to wheel around and attack the Romans from the rear. At this critical moment, Belisarius ordered his Bucellarii nearest to the threat to engage the Persians. Simultaneously, John's retreating forces rallied, turned to face the advancing Persians, and counterattacked, striking the Persian left flank from behind. This maneuver marked the turning point of the battle. In the ensuing melee, Barazmans was killed, and the Persian Immortals began to falter and retreat. The disintegration of the Persian forces in this sector resulted in the loss of approximately 5,000 Persian troops. At this point, the Persian center abandoned the battlefield, fleeing in disarray, followed closely by the remnants of their right flank. Many Persian soldiers were killed in the ensuing pursuit. However, Belisarius and Hermogenes chose not to continue the chase for long. The Persians were well known for their ability to recover from a rout and often turn the tide against their pursuers. Belisarius, aware of the potential for a cornered army to fight with desperation and possibly turn defeat into victory, was cautious not to risk such a scenario. Instead, he opted for a decisive victory, ensuring that his troops could capitalize on their success and enjoy the morale boost that came with a clear and uncontested triumph. As Procopius observes, the Battle of Dara represented a significant turning point in the protracted conflict on the Eastern Front. It marked the first time in several years that a Roman force, one that was numerically inferior, was able to decisively defeat the Persians in battle. This outcome had a profound impact on the morale of both the Roman and Persian forces. From a tactical standpoint, it is notable that the battle primarily involved the cavalry of both sides. The Roman infantry remained in a strong defensive position at the center, protected by the central ditch, while the Persian infantry, likely positioned in the center, played little to no role in the battle until the final stages of the rout. According to Procopius, the Persians suffered heavy losses, with more than half of their forces being killed or incapacitated. As a result, they were reluctant to engage the Romans in direct combat again. Despite this defeat, the Persians retained around 25,000 men, a force large enough to prevent the Romans from attempting to capture Nisibis. Consequently, the remainder of 530 saw a shift to skirmishing warfare along the frontier, where the Romans typically emerged victorious, although the larger strategic situation remained unresolved. In the spring of AD 530, Belisarius successfully defended Mesopotamia, but the war was far from over. The Persians had assembled another army in Persia. The strategic objective of this Persian invasion was likely to sever Lazica's ties with the Romans and to gain the support of potential Armenian defectors. In the summer of AD 530, the Persian king Kavadh launched a second invasion. This Persian force consisted primarily of allied contingents, including Persarmenians and Sunnitai, as well as 3,000 Sabir Huns. The command of this mixed force of Persians and their allies was entrusted to Mir Mihro. Opposing them were the Roman forces under the leadership of Sittas, the Magister Militum Presentalis, and his successor Dorotheus, who served as Magister Militum per Armenium. According to Procopius, the Roman army, numbering 15,000 soldiers, was outnumbered 2-1 by the Persian forces. Mihir Miro began assembling his forces near the Byzantine border fortress of Theodosiopolis. Upon learning of the Persian preparations, the Romans dispatched 2 spearmen to gather intelligence on the Persian forces. Both men successfully infiltrated the Sasanian camp, meticulously observing and noting its details before departing. However, as they traveled through the region on their return, they unexpectedly encountered a group of hostile Huns. One of the spies, named Thannuris, was captured and bound by the Huns, while the other managed to escape. The survivor promptly returned to the Roman generals and reported all the information he had gathered. Seizing the opportunity, the Romans mobilized their entire force and launched a surprise assault on the Sasanian camp. The Sasanians, taken completely off guard, were struck with panic and offered no resistance, fleeing in disarray. The Romans capitalized on the chaos, killing many of the enemy, plundering the camp, and swiftly withdrawing. However, this sudden attack did little to dishearten the Persians. Within a few days, Mihir Miro reorganized his forces and launched an invasion of Roman Armenia. Leveraging his numerical superiority, Mihir Miro aimed to engage the Romans in a decisive battle. In response, the Roman commanders adopted guerrilla tactics, avoiding direct confrontation while harassing the Persian forces. This strategy persisted until the two armies eventually converged near the vicinity of Satala, where the conflict was poised to escalate. It is highly probable that Satala functioned as the principal fortress for the Legio XV Apollinaris, or a successor unit, which would have necessitated a well-equipped garrison to safeguard its formidable walls. When the Persian army approached the city, they swiftly began to encircle Satala, signaling their intent to lay siege to it. In anticipation of the impending confrontation, Citus, the Roman commander, devised a strategic response. He meticulously selected a contingent of 1,000 elite cavalrymen, known for their exceptional skill and agility in battle. Under the cover of darkness and the undulating terrain of the hills that adorned the plain surrounding Satala, Citus concealed his forces, positioning them advantageously to launch a surprise attack. Meanwhile, he made the decisive choice to keep Dorotheus and the remainder of the Roman soldiers within the security of the city walls. This determination arose from a careful evaluation of the circumstances, acknowledging that engaging the Persians in open combat would be ill-advised given the overwhelming numerical superiority of their foes. The Persian forces boasted an impressive strength of no fewer than 30,000 soldiers, while the Roman contingent was barely half that, making any direct confrontation extremely perilous. Thus, Citus's strategy revolved around waiting for the opportune moment to strike, leveraging the element of surprise against a vastly larger enemy. The following day, the Sasanians approached the walls and began preparations for a siege of the town. However, Citus, anticipating this move, executed his ambush with precision. As his forces descended from the high ground, the thick cloud of dust raised by the summer heat obscured the actual number of troops, leading the Sasanians to mistakenly believe that the Romans were far more numerous than they truly were. In a state of panic, they abandoned their plans to encircle the town and hurriedly attempted to form a battle line. Citus capitalized on this confusion by dividing his ambushers into two groups, successfully encircling a portion of the retreating enemy forces. At that moment, Dorotheus decisively opened the gates of the city, leading his cavalry out into the fray. Even in the face of this double surprise attack, the Persians exhibited remarkable resilience, managing to regroup the remnants of their forces thanks to their significant numerical advantage. The ensuing clash, as described by Procopius, was fiercely contested, marked by a chaotic rhythm of rapid advances and retreats. This back-and-forth movement was a characteristic feature of cavalry engagements, as both armies sought to exploit openings while maintaining their lines. The battlefield became a maelstrom of clashing steel and swirling dust, with both sides determined to claim victory amidst the chaos. Then the Thracian Florentius, leading his Catalogos of cavalry, charged into the enemy's center. He successfully captured the general's standard, forcing it to the ground, and began his retreat. Although he was eventually caught and killed, his daring actions proved pivotal in securing victory for the Romans. This assault showcased the exceptional skill of the Thracian Catalogoi. Consequently, The battle between the two Armenian armies was ultimately determined by the bravery of the Thracians. The loss of the standard instilled great panic among the Persians, resulting in chaos and fear. Unable to maintain their formation, they retreated to their camp where they remained in silence. The following day, the Persians retreated to Persian Armenia, unchallenged by the Byzantines, who were content with their victory over a significantly larger force. This triumph marked a significant success for Byzantium and prompted the defection of several Armenian chieftains to the empire, including the brothers Narses and Aretius, who had previously defeated Cidas and Belisarius. Additionally, several key fortresses, such as Boulum and Pharangium, were either captured or surrendered. The loss of Pharangium was particularly damaging for the Persians, as it had been their primary source of gold, severely impacting their ability to sustain the war effort. Following the battle, negotiations between Persia and Byzantium resumed, but yielded no results. By the spring of 531, hostilities reignited, culminating in the campaign that led to the Battle of Callinicum. The year AD 530 marked a significant success for the Eastern Roman Empire. Despite being outnumbered, Roman forces achieved two decisive victories against the armies of their greatest eastern adversary, the Sasanian Empire. These triumphs provided ample justification for concluding the war, and Emperor Justinian sought to capitalize on the favorable situation. Rather than pressing further militarily, he directed his efforts toward diplomacy, sending peace offers to the Sasanian king, Kavadh. Justinian even proposed a one-time monetary payment to facilitate an agreement. However, Kavadh faced internal political pressures that complicated the prospects of peace. Accepting a settlement after two humiliating defeats would have jeopardized the stability of Khosrow's succession, Kavadh's chosen heir. Additionally, the Romans had failed to exploit their battlefield successes fully, allowing the Sasanians time to regroup. It is plausible, and perhaps even likely, that Kavadh had planned this strategy from the outset. By initiating peace negotiations, he effectively bought time to reorganize his forces and strengthen his position. Kavadh also sought to improve his leverage in future negotiations by resuming the offensive. The defection of Armenian fortresses and noblemen to the Romans had exposed the precarious state of the Sasanian position, and Kavadh recognized the necessity of securing victories to stabilize his rule and bolster his negotiating stance. The recent defeats demonstrated to the Sasanians that the Romans now maintained sufficient forces in Mesopotamia and Armenia to effectively defend their newly fortified cities. In response, Kavadh sought an alternative strategy and eagerly embraced the counsel of the Lakhmid Phylarch, Al-Mundir. Utilizing Lakhmid expertise, a mixed Sasanian Arab force of approximately 15,000 cavalry, led by the Spabat Azarethas, advanced through Euphratesia and Syria. Along their route, the force systematically targeted and devastated vulnerable settlements and lightly defended areas. The unexpected direction of the Persian attack caught the Romans off guard, but the resourceful Belisarius responded swiftly, moving south to confront the enemy. He left the bulk of his army stationed at Dara and other fortified cities in Mesopotamia, suspecting that the attack might be a diversion, and took with him only 3,000 horsemen and 5,000 Ghassanid Arab allies to ensure rapid movement. This precaution proved effective, as the Persians, led by a member of the Mihran family, besieged Dara after Belisarius had departed, but were unsuccessful. In these circumstances, Belisarius's primary objective was to prevent the Persians from causing significant damage and to drive them out of Roman territory without taking unnecessary risks. This cautious and measured approach would become a hallmark of his military strategy. With this in mind, Belisarius instructed his commanders not to engage the Persians until he had fully assembled his forces. After making contact with the Persian forces who were pillaging the surrounding countryside, Belisarius established his camp at Chalcis, while the Persians were stationed near Gabula. However, ignoring Belisarius's direct orders not to engage the Persians, the Dux Sunicus took matters into his own hands, leading 4,000 men in a surprise attack that successfully routed the Persians from their fortified camp. While this disobedience achieved remarkable results, it is unclear whether Belisarius was more displeased by Sunicus's defiance or his success. The ensuing dispute between the two officers escalated to the point that it required the intervention of Magister Officiorum Hermogenes, who had the authority to enforce cooperation between them. Hermogenes arrived at Hierapolis with reinforcements and proceeded south to Barbalissus, where the Roman forces assembled. His arrival marked the point at which the Roman army was finally consolidated. Despite his efforts to mediate, reconciling Belisarius with his subordinate commanders proved to be a challenging task. Strategically, however, Belisarius and Hermogenes were in agreement. Their primary objective was to compel the Persians to withdraw from Roman territory without engaging in major battles. Belisarius understood the limitations of his force, which, while numbering over 20,000 infantry and cavalry, was not ideally suited to confront the well-organized Persian army. He regarded certain contingents, such as the Lycaonian infantry, as inferior in quality. Furthermore, if Procopius's criticisms of the Arabs reflected Belisarius's own views, it is likely that the general had little confidence in the combat effectiveness of his Arab allies. Local commanders, however, held a different perspective, likely influenced by recent events. In 529, prisoners taken by the Lakhmid leader Mundir had been ransomed for a significant sum, while others had been killed during their captivity. These experiences may have fueled their eagerness to engage the enemy more aggressively. Confronted with a numerically superior enemy, the Persian commander Azarethas began a strategic withdrawal toward the Persian frontier. Belisarius pursued cautiously, maintaining a distance of roughly 1 day's march. Along the way, his troops often utilized the abandoned Persian camps from the previous day as temporary accommodations. The pursuit culminated near Callinicum, where Belisarius finally caught up with the Persian army on the eve of Easter Sunday in 531. The Roman forces adhered to Belisarius's cautious strategy until the retreating Persians reached Callinicum. At this point, Callinicum presented the final opportunity for the Romans to confront the enemy, and the officers and soldiers, emboldened by their recent victories, were eager for battle. Despite their best efforts to dissuade the troops, both Belisarius and Hermogenes were ultimately compelled to lead the men into combat to avoid the risk of mutiny. This situation further reinforced the commander's cautious approach. By this stage, the Roman soldiers were physically exhausted from their prolonged march, and the rigors of Easter fasting exacerbated their fatigue. Compounding these challenges, a portion of the Roman infantry had not yet arrived at the battlefield and remained en route. The soldiers and officers, however, advanced a compelling argument. Roman military doctrine emphasized the importance of engaging a retreating enemy force when it was weakened and nearing the frontier. Given this expectation, it is unsurprising that Belisarius and Hermogenes were unable to dissuade their troops from pressing for battle. Belisarius adopted a single-line formation at Callinicum to match the length of the Persian battle line. This arrangement, known in Roman military terminology as the mixed formation, was specifically designed for engagements against cavalry-heavy forces. On the left flank, regular infantry commanded by Peter were positioned near the Euphrates River on slightly elevated terrain. In the center, Belisarius himself took command of the heavy cavalry, forming the core of the Roman line. While the precise position of Sunicus and Symmas, commanding the Huns and light cavalry of the Byzantine army, remains uncertain, it is most likely they were stationed on Belisarius's right wing. To their right, a Byzantine cavalry force under Ascan, comprising formidable cataphracts, occupied a position similar to that which they had held at the Battle of Dara. Further to the right, the Lycaonian infantry recruits, commanded by Longinus and Stephanatius, were positioned in the rougher terrain, where their abilities were believed to be better suited. On the far right flank, the 5,000 Ghassanids, led by their phylarch Al-Harith, guarded the extreme edge of the line. While the Roman order of battle at Callinicum is less well documented than at Dara, it seems that Belisarius employed a strategy contrasting with that of the previous year. At Dara, he had avoided engaging in the center and instead concentrated his strength on the flanks. At Callinicum, however, he placed his strongest forces, the heavy cavalry, in the center, while the infantry was stationed on the wings. This arrangement may reflect his anticipation that the infantry could break under pressure or that the Sassanids might abandon their positions. Nevertheless, Belisarius likely hoped this formation would allow him to preserve the cohesion and effectiveness of his main force. When the Persians observed the Roman formation, they arranged their army accordingly. On their right flank were the Persian forces under Azarethes, while the Lakhmid allies under Al-Mundir occupied the left. This situation was advantageous for the Persians, as the Romans' adoption of the mixed battle formation left the initiative in the hands of the enemy. The Roman formation was inherently defensive, limiting the ability of their cavalry to advance far beyond the infantry without risking the cohesion of the entire line. Taking advantage of this static Roman arrangement, the Persians were able to harass their opponents with continuous volleys of arrows. It is likely that the Persian army was organized into two rotating lines, allowing them to maintain a steady barrage of missile fire while giving their archers time to rest and rearm. This tactic exploited the vulnerabilities of the Roman position, forcing them to endure sustained attacks without an effective means of retaliation. The battle commenced with the customary exchange of missiles. The Romans, equipped with stiffer bows, were capable of firing more powerful shots. Additionally, their use of foot archers enhanced the potency of their volleys. However, this advantage was offset by the Persians' faster rate of fire and a favorable westerly wind, which increased the range and force of their arrows. Procopius noted that many Persian arrows were rendered ineffective by the superior Byzantine armor, while the fewer Roman arrows exhibited greater penetrative power. Despite this, the archery duel appeared evenly matched on the surface. In reality, however, the Romans suffered significantly. The strong westerly wind amplified the effectiveness of the Persians' already more numerous volleys, tilting the balance in their favor. The ultimate result of this exchange remains inconclusive, but it is evident that the Roman forces were severely disadvantaged. By this point in the engagement, the Romans were likely exhausted from a combination of fasting, extended marches, and sustained combat. Their fatigue was further exacerbated by the lack of a proper midday meal, leaving them in a weakened state as the battle progressed. The Persians' next tactic involved attempting to provoke Sunicus and Simas into breaking formation by executing a feigned attack. However, this maneuver failed to achieve the desired result, as the two commanders didn't take the bait and maintained their positions within the formation. Azarethes then redeployed a significant portion of his elite cavalry to the left wing, positioning them alongside the Lakhmids. This maneuver would prove critical. At the Battle of Dara, a similar tactic had been detected by the Byzantines, who had successfully countered it. However, on this occasion, the movement went unnoticed, and the subsequent attack was decisive. Without reinforcement, the Byzantine right wing collapsed under the onslaught. The combined forces of the Sassanid and Lakhmid cavalry struck the Byzantine right flank with such speed and intensity that the Ghassanid contingent immediately melted away, leaving the Lycaonian infantry and Ascan's cavalry to defend the position alone. This allowed the Persians to secure control of the higher ground, further consolidating their tactical advantage. This allowed the Persians to launch an attack on the rear of the Roman formation. Byzantine commander Ascan led his cataphracts in an effort to halt the Persian advance, resulting in heavy fighting on the Roman right flank. Together with the Lycaonian infantry, Ascan's cavalry managed to momentarily stem the Persian offensive. However, both Lycaonian leaders, Longinus and Stephanatius, were killed. And Ascan's cavalry soon found themselves surrounded on three sides. According to Procopius, Ascan put up a strong resistance, fighting until he and 800 of his men fell. His death severely undermined the morale of the inexperienced Lycaonian troops, who had been among the most vocal critics of Belisarius. Some of the Lycaonian soldiers offered only token resistance and were swiftly cut down, while others fled northward, attempting to escape by crossing the Euphrates. This retreat further disrupted the already vulnerable Roman position. As the pressure mounted, the remaining Byzantine cavalry fled, leaving only the infantry to face the advancing Persians. The account of Malalas, however, offers a distinct interpretation, though it benefits from being based on the official report made after the battle. According to Malalas, the Ghassanids under al-Harith fought valiantly, and the collapse of the right wing was actually triggered by the death of Ascan, who had charged into the heart of the Persian forces. His death led to the flight of the Lycaonian troops, which in turn caused the Ghassanids to retreat, except for those around al-Harith. Malalas also mentions that some sources, including Belisarius, Procopius, and their allies, attributed the flight of the Arabs to the treachery of the Phylarchs. Given the inherent friction of wartime accounts, it is difficult to determine which version is entirely accurate. However, it is possible to reconcile the differing accounts by proposing that the Arabs were already beginning to retreat when Ascan made his desperate charge in an attempt to halt their flight. His death, in this scenario, would have acted as the final catalyst, leading to the rout of both the Arabs and the Lycaonians, as suggested by Malalas. The Persians pursued the fleeing Romans for a short distance before turning back to attack the infantry phalanx, which was composed of Belisarius's dismounted cavalry and regular infantry. In response to the Persian assault from the south, the Roman army shifted its alignment by 90 degrees, positioning the Euphrates at their rear. At this point, where the battle came down to infantry engagement, the sources diverge. Procopius states that Belisarius retired to the infantry, dismounted, and fought alongside them until nightfall. In contrast, Malalas claims that Belisarius fled earlier in the battle, escaping by boat across the river. According to Malalas, it was Sunicus and Simas who dismounted with their troops to fight alongside the infantry. Belisarius is widely recognized as a defensive commander, a characteristic that recurs throughout his campaigns. This defensive approach is evident in the way the Roman infantry fought at Callinicum. Their actions were deliberate and focused on holding their ground, aligning with Belisarius's preference for disciplined, reactive tactics. In contrast, Sunicus was known for his aggressive command style, excelling in flanking maneuvers and surprise attacks, as seen in the Battle of Dara and the early stages of the Callinicum campaign. This more offensive approach, however, seems at odds with the defensive nature of the infantry engagement at Callinicum. While Sunicus likely played a key role in the cavalry maneuvers, the cautious strategy of the infantry does not align with his typical tactics. Given this, it seems reasonable to assume that Belisarius himself was more directly involved with the infantry at Callinicum. His ability to organize and lead a disciplined defensive effort likely influenced their performance. However, battlefields are complex and command roles can overlap, suggesting that Sunicus may have adapted his tactics or contributed in ways not typically associated with his usual style. The absence of detailed records leaves room for alternative interpretations, making the true dynamics of the battle subject to ongoing debate. The infantry adopted the fulcrum formation, which later became the equivalent of the famous testudo used to defend against heavy missile attacks. Procopius describes a formation that closely resembles the fulcrum outlined in the strategicon, characterized by a dense mass of soldiers where the shields of the front rank interlock, while those of the second rank hold their shields above the heads of the frontline troops. Although Belisarius's troops probably didn't keep their lances to fight off the Persian cavalry, as suggested in the strategicon, the archers behind the shield wall would still have been able to cause significant damage to the attackers. They arranged themselves in a U shape, with the river closing off the top. The discipline of the infantry remaining on the south bank is demonstrated by their steadfastness in the face of enemy charges. To counter the Persian cavalry, they employed the tactic of clashing their shields, a well-known method for frightening horses. The phalanx massed together to create a barricade of protruding spears. The tightness of the formation, the effective archery from foot soldiers, the clashing of shields, and the wall of spears were sufficient to disrupt the Persian cavalry's frontal charge. With foot archers positioned in the center of the U, providing overhead supporting fire, the infantry was able to withstand the Persian assault. However, the Persians did not relent. They repeated their charges and attacked again and again until late in the day, when they finally withdrew in frustration after sustaining heavy casualties. The Persian retreat provided the Romans with an opportunity to fall back to a nearby island, from where they retreated to Callinicum the following day by freight boats. Procopius deliberately avoids providing an overall estimate of Roman casualties, stating only that the Persians did not find their own dead less numerous than the enemy's, likely in an attempt to downplay the extent of the Roman defeat. However, it is plausible that the Sassanids suffered relatively few casualties during the earlier stages of the battle. As the conflict progressed, the determined resistance of the Roman infantry and the repeated unsuccessful cavalry charges by the Sassanids likely increased Persian losses. Despite this, the Battle of Callinicum concluded with a decisive defeat for Rome and Belisarius, negating the advantages gained from the earlier victory at Dara and shifting the strategic initiative back to the Persians. The strategic outcome of the battle was effectively a stalemate. The Byzantine army suffered significant losses and would not be fit for combat again for several months. However, the Persian army also endured heavy casualties, rendering it ineffective for its original objective of invading Syria. Following the battle, Azarethes continued his retreat, eventually reaching the Persian court. Kavadh, the Sasanian emperor, appeared unimpressed with his general's victory. The campaign had yielded minimal gains, with Gabala being the only notable capture, and casualties had been high. As a result, Kavadh removed Azarethes from command and stripped him of his honors. On the Roman side, an inquiry led by Constantoilus was conducted regarding Belisarius's defeat at Callinicum, as well as his earlier loss at Thannuris. Belisarius blamed his troops for their eagerness to engage in battle at Callinicum, and he was ultimately cleared by the inquiry. However, he was relieved of his position as Magister Militum per Orientem and recalled to Constantinople by Emperor Justinian. Following the Battle of Callinicum, the Roman envoy Hermogenes traveled to the Sassanid court in an attempt to reopen negotiations. However, the Shahanshah Kavadh remained unyielding, still seeking to secure a strategic advantage over the Romans before considering peace. As part of this effort, he ordered an invasion of Osrhoene, targeting the fortified settlement of Abgersatan. The city's defenses were vulnerable due to its aging brick walls, making it an attractive target for the Sassanids. At the time, the Roman general Buzes was stationed in Amida, having been sidelined from recent campaigns due to illness. Nevertheless, he swiftly dispatched his nephew, Domnentiolus, with reinforcements to aid the defenders. The Roman garrison despite being outnumbered, resisted with remarkable tenacity. Their archers inflicted heavy casualties, reportedly slaying 1,000 Sassanid soldiers. When their supply of arrows was exhausted, the defenders resorted to hurling stones from the battlements, continuing to inflict losses on the besieging force. Buzes himself led a relief force from Amida, but his efforts proved futile. Meanwhile, the Sassanids deployed an array of siege engines, eventually breaching the city's weakened walls. Sensing an imminent assault, the Roman defenders prepared for a desperate last stand. As the Sassanid warriors surged through the breach, the garrison countered with ruthless efficiency. Abandoning the walls, they met the attackers head-on in brutal close-quarters combat, hacking down all who entered the city. The narrow passage, choked with fallen bodies, momentarily stalled the Sassanid advance. Realizing that a direct assault on the breach was too costly, the Sassanids devised an alternative strategy. Under cover of darkness, they sent detachments armed with ladders to scale the walls at points left exposed by the Romans' focus on the main breach. This tactic proved decisive. Once inside, the Sassanids unleashed a massacre, cutting down the defenders and the city's inhabitants alike. Only a handful managed to escape the slaughter. With their objective achieved, the victorious Sassanid forces withdrew to their own territory, having demonstrated both their resilience and tactical adaptability in overcoming the determined Roman resistance. During this time, Belisarius and his forces remained inactive, as the emperor had dispatched Constantius to investigate his conduct during the Battle of Callinicum. The outcome of this inquiry led to Belisarius' dismissal, suggesting that Constantius found the accusations of his detractors more credible. However, this does not necessarily mean that his assessment was accurate. As I mentioned in my previous video, there were differing interpretations of Belisarius' actions, and the investigation's conclusions may have been influenced by political considerations. In particular, it is possible that the decision to remove Belisarius was partly motivated by a desire to appease the Arab allies, whose loyalty was crucial to the Roman war effort. Following Belisarius' dismissal, Mundus was appointed as the new Magister Militum per Orientum, assuming overall command of Roman military operations in the east. Additionally, Magister Militum Presentalis Citus was entrusted with the region's defense, while Demosthenes was assigned to oversee the provisioning of cities and fortresses. This role placed him in charge of organizing the logistics necessary to sustain both defensive operations and future campaigns. At the same time, diplomatic efforts to pressure Kavadh were intensified. The Lakhmid king, Al-Mundir, attempted to initiate negotiations through a deacon named Sergius. However, this overture was rejected, though Sergius was sent back to Al-Mundir bearing gifts from the emperor, likely as a gesture to maintain diplomatic goodwill. Following this, Justinian responded directly to Kavadh in the wake of Al-Mundir's initiative. He dispatched Rufinus to urge the Shahanshah to seek a peaceful resolution, emphasizing that it is honorable and glorious to ensure peace between our two states. Justinian also issued a bold, though ultimately unrealistic, threat. "If you do not do this, I shall seize the Persian land for myself." While the claim lacked credibility, it was a strategically crafted statement. Given that Kavadh was nearly 80 years old, he would have been particularly concerned with securing a stable succession for his designated heir Khusro, and likely wished to avoid any additional instability. Later that year, Rufinus was sent to Kavadh once again, this time accompanied by Strategius. They carried gifts from both Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora, intended for the Shahanshah and his wife. However, their diplomatic mission was halted at Edessa as Kavadh postponed their audience until he had launched yet another invasion of Roman territory. The remaining military operations of the war occurred further north, where the campaigning season did not begin until summer. During this period, the Sassanids launched a final attempt to capture the Roman stronghold at Martyropolis. Meanwhile, Magister Militum per Armenium Dorotheus took the offensive in Perse Armenia, successfully securing several key Sassanid fortresses. Kavadh's decision to besiege Martyropolis was influenced by events that had unfolded earlier that summer along the frontier between Sophanene and Arzanene. Gadar the Kadasine, a local commander responsible for defending Arzanene on behalf of the Sassanid king, led an incursion into Sophanene. Commanding a cavalry force of approximately 6,000 men, he raided the lands surrounding Atachas, plundering the region and disrupting Roman defenses. The Duks stationed at Martyropolis, Bessas, responded swiftly to the Sassanid incursion by launching a counteroffensive. Leading a force of 500 cavalry, he marched out of Martyropolis and engaged the enemy near the river Nymphaeus in the vicinity of Amida. However, his initial attack failed as the Sassanid forces mounted a determined and well-coordinated defense. Unable to break their lines, Bessas was forced to retreat. Buoyed by their successful defense, the Sassanid cavalry made a critical mistake. In their eagerness to press their advantage, they abandoned their formation and pursued the retreating Romans in a state of disorder. Recognizing the opportunity, Bessas seized the moment. He swiftly ordered his troops to wheel around and launch a sudden countercharge. The Roman cavalry, now attacking with precision and discipline, crashed into the scattered Sassanid riders. The ensuing engagement was a massacre. 2,000 Sassanid cavalry were cut down in the chaos. The rout continued as the surviving Sassanids fled toward the river Nymphaeus. Many, in their desperation to escape, attempted to cross its strong currents, only to be swept away and drowned. The Romans not only secured a decisive victory, but also captured several Sassanid generals and battle standards. Among the fallen was the Sassanid commander Gadar, while Yazdgird, the nephew of Hormizd, the governor of Arzanene, was taken prisoner. Emboldened by his triumph, Bessas carried the offensive further by ravaging the lands of Arzanene. This act was more than just a military maneuver. It was a direct affront to the Sassanid Shahanshah, as the province was considered his personal domain. This bold display of Roman aggression sent a clear message to the Sassanid court, underscoring the empire's resilience and ability to strike back. The raid on Arzanene deeply angered Kavadh, prompting him to launch yet another invasion to avenge the Roman incursion and punish Bessas. To this end, the Sassanids assembled a larger army under the command of Chanaranges, Asbebides, and Mihir, with the objective of besieging Martyropolis. The city was defended by Buzes and Bessas, but its fortifications were incomplete, making it vulnerable to attack. The walls had been constructed only recently, provisions were insufficient, and the garrison lacked siege engines, further compromising its defensive capabilities. The Sassanid force included a contingent of Hunnic cavalry, recruited by Mihir Girowi, which added to the army's mobility and striking power. Their campaign began with an invasion of Roman Mesopotamia, after which they advanced northward, passing through the rugged terrain of Tur Abdin, before crossing the Tigris into Sophanene. Even without Bessas's recent victories, Martyropolis had long been a strategic concern for the Sassanids. The city functioned as both a staging ground and a refuge for Roman forces, allowing them to conduct raids deep into Persian territory, particularly in Arzanene. The renovations undertaken there by Emperor Justinian in 528 had only increased its strategic importance, making it an even greater threat to Sassanid control in the region. By September 531, the Sassanid army had established its camp outside Martyropolis and begun a determined siege. The Roman defenders, unprepared for an assault so late in the campaigning season, faced severe shortages of supplies and feared that they would not be able to withstand a prolonged attack. Kavadh had issued strict orders that the army was not to return until the city had fallen, compelling the Sassanid commanders to employ every possible method to breach its defenses. The besiegers launched a multi-pronged assault, employing mining operations to undermine the walls, constructing a mound to provide a direct approach, and erecting scaling ladders for an infantry assault. Additionally, they built a massive wooden siege tower designed to provide cover and allow their troops to storm the walls. Yet, despite their efforts, the defenders of Martyropolis proved as resilient as those of Amida 3 decades earlier, responding with ingenuity and determination. One particularly clever countermeasure turned the tide of the siege. Within the city, the defenders hastily constructed an even taller tower, giving them the advantage of height over the Sassanid siege tower. From this elevated position, Roman archers and slingers rained missiles down upon the attackers, rendering their tower ineffective. Then, in a final stroke of ingenuity, the Romans deployed a siege engine that dropped massive stones onto the Sassanid forces below. The impact was devastating. Siege equipment was crushed, soldiers were buried beneath the rubble, and the carefully coordinated assault dissolved into chaos. Despite their superior numbers and siege technology, the Sassanids found themselves frustrated by the city's stubborn resistance. The defenders, though undersupplied, fought with remarkable ingenuity, forcing the Sassanids to reassess their strategy as the siege dragged on. The Sassanids soon found that the defenders of Martyropolis held several key advantages that had been absent during the siege of Amida in 502. First, the city's garrison included booths and a substantial Roman force, likely reinforced by the numerous stationed there by Justinian in 528. Their presence significantly bolstered the city's defensive capabilities. More crucially, however, Roman reinforcements were already on the move. As the siege wore on, Magister Militum Praesentalis Citus assembled a large Roman army and was joined by Alharith and Hermogenes. By October or November, their combined forces had reached Amida. From there, they advanced to Atachus, a position just 20 kilometers north of the besieging Sassanid army. By this time, likely November or December, the mere presence of the approaching relief force was enough to shift the course of events. The harsh winter climate had already begun to take its toll on the Sassanid besiegers, and the rumor of a large Roman army advancing toward them only added to their mounting difficulties. During this time, a highly skilled Sassanid spy defected to the Romans, revealing critical state secrets to Emperor Justinian. Among the most valuable intelligence he provided was the impending invasion of the Sabir Huns, who had been enlisted as allies of the Sassanids. Recognizing an opportunity for deception, Justinian devised a brilliant stratagem. He sent the defector back to the Sassanid army with false information, claiming that the Huns were instead preparing to fight alongside the Romans. This psychological maneuver was masterfully executed, sowing confusion and uncertainty among the Sassanid ranks. It is unlikely that the timing of these espionage activities, both the presence of Roman and Sassanid spies and the defection of a double agent, was mere coincidence. At the heart of these operations was Magister Officiorum Hermogenes, a key figure in the Roman administration. As Magister Officiorum, he not only oversaw governmental and diplomatic affairs, functioning as a de facto prime minister and foreign minister, but also served as the empire's chief spy master. His role in orchestrating these intelligence efforts suggests that he was one of the most capable spy masters the Romans ever had, skillfully using deception and counterintelligence to gain an advantage over the Sassanids. Upon learning of the setbacks suffered by the Sassanid forces, Kavadh experienced a sudden paralysis on the right side of his body on 8th of September 531. Aware that his time was short, he formally designated his second son, Khosrow, as his successor by placing a crown upon his head. His most trusted advisor, the Hazarbed Mobodes, urged him to put this decision in writing to secure Khosrow's claim. 5 days later, on the 13th of September, Kavadh passed away at the age of 82. According to the historian Malalas, his reign had lasted 43 years and 2 months. Following Kavadh's death, a succession dispute arose. His eldest son, Kawus, assumed that he would inherit the throne and laid claim to it after his father's burial. However, Mobodes opposed his claim, and the matter was put to a vote among the Sassanid nobility. The magnates ultimately confirmed Khosrow's right to rule, largely due to the written declaration left by Kavadh. With his position now secure, Khosrow sought to consolidate his authority by pursuing diplomatic stability. He immediately sent a message to the Roman ambassadors inviting them to enter Sassanid territory to negotiate a peace treaty. Meanwhile, news of Kavadh's death quickly reached the Sassanid forces besieging Martyropolis. Recognizing that the new ruler was more inclined toward peace and unwilling to continue the costly campaign, the besiegers abandoned their positions and withdrew into Persian territory. However, Hermogenes, acting as the Roman envoy, refused to proceed with negotiations without receiving explicit authorization from Emperor Justinian. This approval soon arrived, allowing peace talks to formally commence. The arrival of the Huns to support the Sassanids came only after peace negotiations had already begun, and their invasion ultimately proved to be a failure, despite claims to the contrary by Zechariah and Malalas. These sources exaggerate the extent of the Hunnic success, stating that the invaders plundered the Armenian provinces before crossing the Euphrates and launching raids as far as Euphratesia, Kirestik, and even the outskirts of Antioch. They also suggest that only a few Roman commanders, Bessus, the Dux of Citharazon, and Dorotheus, offered resistance and managed to recover some of the stolen goods. However, the account of Procopius, which downplays the significance of the Hunnic invasion, is far more credible. The evidence strongly suggests that the Roman response to the Huns followed established military doctrine with precision. Forewarned of the impending invasion, the Romans had ample time to implement defensive measures. Most of the civilian population, along with their valuables, was relocated inside fortified cities, leaving the countryside barren and denying the raiders easy plunder. As a result, the Huns found little to sustain their campaign, and their attacks were largely ineffective. Roman strategy relied on a combination of shadowing and guerrilla warfare, utilizing fortifications and ambushes to weaken the enemy. Once the Huns began their retreat, exhausted and demoralized from their largely unsuccessful raids, Roman forces were able to strike at their leisure. This tactical approach ensured that the invaders suffered heavy losses while achieving minimal gains. The only civilians likely to have suffered at the hands of the Huns were those who, for whatever reason, failed to take refuge in the fortified settlements. After a prolonged period of negotiations, Khosrow, the newly crowned Shahanshah of Persia, and Emperor Justinian reached a formal peace agreement, which was ratified in the spring of 532. Under its terms, both parties committed to the mutual exchange of fortresses captured during the conflict. The Romans ceded Pharangium and the fortress of Bolum to the Sassanids, an important concession as these territories were rich in gold production, while the Sassanids returned the fortresses they had taken in Lazica. Additionally, both sides agreed to repatriate prisoners of war. Among those returned to the Romans was Dagaris, who, according to Procopius, later distinguished himself by repeatedly defeating the Huns in battle and expelling them when they attempted to invade Roman territory. A crucial element of the treaty was Rome's agreement to pay a one-time sum of 11,000 pounds of gold. The Romans also agreed to relocate the headquarters of the Magister Militum per Orientum from Dara to Constantia. Both parties also proclaimed the establishment of what was described as an eternal peace. For the Romans, this financial settlement was manageable. The amount constituted only half of Egypt's annual tax revenue. More importantly, securing peace in the east allowed Justinian to redirect his military focus toward the west, enabling him to take action against Gelimer for his overthrow of the pro-Roman Vandal king, Hilderic, and to begin his ambitious campaign of imperial restoration.